Good morning and welcome. Welcome to our Clinical Culture and Diversity series, Developing Cross-Cultural Competencies with Harlan Pruden and his presentation, Relational Accountability, Being in Good Relations, Two-Spirit and Indigenous Health Research as a Site of Reconciliation. This is part of our International Education Week, and it also is part of our Native American Heritage Month. Clinical Culture and Diversity series is brought to you today in collaboration with the Office of International Programs, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion with the School of Medicine, and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for KUMC. This is one of a four-part series that we have in September, November, February, and April. Okay, so because this is part of International Education Week, I have a message from our office about International Education Week. Happy International Education Week and welcome to this program sponsored by the Office of International Programs at KUMC as part of International Education Week. This week is a week for celebration, a celebration of diverse cultures, languages, people, and the relationships and connections we have forged here and across oceans and continents. This is a time to celebrate our friendships and to celebrate in our collective and individual accomplishments. According to the Department of State, International Education Week, which is November 14th through the 18th, is an opportunity to celebrate the benefits of international education and exchange worldwide. This joint initiative of the U.S. Department of State and the U.S. Department of Education is part of our efforts to promote programs that prepare Americans for a global environment and attract future leaders from abroad to study, learn, and exchange experiences. Here at KUMC, we know very well how much our international friends in college contribute to our community and how grateful we are that they choose to work, study, or do research here at KUMC. Diversity is essential to creativity of thought and expanding our mental horizons and understandings. Simply put, we all need to interact with others who think differently and perceive the world differently, as it makes each of us better, smarter, and a little more empathetic and understanding. As Senator Fulbright stated, we must try to expand the boundaries of human wisdom, empathy, and perception. And there's no way of doing that except through education. The essence of intercultural education is the acquisition of empathy, the ability to see the world as others see it, and to allow for the possibility that others may see something we have failed to see or may see it more accurately. We know the value of individuals from around the world who come to the U.S. to study and how their presence in America contribute even more profoundly than the billions they contribute yearly to higher education. NAFSA, the National Association of International Educators, analysis of the 21-22 academic year shows that international students and their families contributed $33.8 billion to the U.S. economy. In the state of Kansas, the 8,272 international students enrolled across the state contributed $214 million and supported 1,661 jobs, including mine. We are situated in the heart of America, and many may wonder how our international folks find their way to us. We celebrate the journey of those who come to KUMC, their presence and their immense contributions that enhance our lives every single day. International students, researchers, and employees are part of the heart of our institutions and are woven into the beautiful tapestry of American higher education and American society. Many come to KUMC through the relationships of our faculty and researchers that have been developed over the years through collaborative, mutually beneficial programs and endeavors. We celebrate our faculty, researchers, and administrators who approach international exchange and global health with attitudes and efforts that reflect humility, inquisitiveness, and understanding. Many of our learners, 200 yearly, travel to our partner hosting institution to learn about clinical care, the strengths of other healthcare systems, and the beauty of other cultures and languages. We celebrate our learners who seek to understand other healthcare systems, social and economic health disparities, and innovative patient care from around the world. Many of our partner institutions send their learners to KUMC, participate in virtual exchange, or host our faculty and learners to exchange ideas, learn, and research together, and even to share meals together. We celebrate our partners who make these deep learning experiences possible. Each one of us are part of international exchange, as we are part of the KUMC community. This week is about all of us exchanging, listening, and interacting together. Happy International Education Week. So Harlan Pruden, my friend, is a PhD. He is from the Neheo First Nations Cree, who works with and for the Two-Spirit community locally, nationally, and internationally. Harlan is a co-founder of the Two Spirits Dry Lab and the Indigenous Knowledge Translation lead at Che Mamok, an Indigenous health program at the British Columbia Center for Disease Control. Harlan is also the managing editor of twospiritjournal.com and an advisory member for the Canadian Institutes of Health Research Institute, the NIH of the North of Gender and Health. With this, we welcome Harlan, and we are anxious for his presentation. Thank you, my friend. Welcome.
Welcome. So good to see you again. And thank you very much for that incredible introduction. And I also just would like to say happy IEW, International Education Week. What a beautiful week. Tante, Natuchimchik Harlan Pruden, Ewaka no Mani, Niha, Neha, Niha, Ayawe, Ayak. Away. Kinonos Komtinina Wawa, Musqueam Slayer to Squamish Nehiao. Greetings, my relatives. My government name is Harlan Pruden, and my Indian name, and I do use the I word, you can ask me why later, is Waka no Mani. It's actually in Sioux. I was doing some work, some Two-Spirit work on the Rosebud Reservation, and they honored me with they honored me with that beautiful star blanket and the name Waka no Mani. Waka being spirit, like good spirit, bad spirit, neutral spirit. I can do good just as well as I can do bad, or I can like suck up a lot of space, which I hope I don't do, and do nothing. So that part of my name is a responsibility of how do I want to show up. And so I try to show up with good words, good actions, and good thoughts. And when I fall short of that intention, a mistake is only a mistake if we don't learn from it. And so every misstep or mistake is a learning opportunity. Nom is two, and mani is a sacred journey. And so I tried to get that translated into Cree. It became too difficult. So I just keep a Sioux name, although I am First Nations Cree. My mother was a member of the Beaver Lake Indian Reserve. My father was a member of the Saddle Lake Indian Reserve, two different reservations, but the same signatories to Treaty 6 territory here in what we would know as Canada, and in the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan is Treaty 6 territory. I also am grateful to my Coast Salish relatives on whose land and territory, the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations people. Okay, I sent some like cheat sheets for people to post during the talk. And so this is that land acknowledgement. And I'm so happy to be here today to join to talk about, give me one sec. There we go. Can you see my slide? To talk about relational accountability, being in good relations, Two-Spirit Indigenous health research as a site of reconciliation, or we added the C in reconciliation, because it does take action and or agency. Okay, my other name for today is going to be Motormouth Mabel because I am going to be talking so fast. I apologize. If I'm talking way too fast, flip on your camera and go like this, the international symbol for it. Slow it down, Motormouth. So again, I did a land acknowledgement on whose territory I live on, and it is the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. If someone can open up that email, this is the native-land.com. That is a beautiful interactive website to position you on whose land and on whose territory you are on. Perfect. So I'm going to be talking about Two-Spirit people. So this is the closest that you're going to get to a definition of what and who Two-Spirit people are. And it's a framework, not a definition. And you'll understand why we cannot offer a definition. First of all, Two-Spirit is a community organizing tool and not an identity. And it is often listed as alongside other identities. When you see the acronym of 2S, LGBTQI+, can go on, right? But it is really not an identity. It's a community organizing tool to identify those individuals who are Indigenous to Turtle Island and are either on the gender and or the sexual orientation spectrum. We'll unpack that later on in the presentation. Two-Spirit doesn't make sense unless it's contextualized or embedded within an Indigenous framework or community or setting. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Within a traditional setting or a pre-contact setting, and even in a contemporary setting, Two-Spirit was a gender analysis as opposed to, and not a sexual orientation. And so for many Two-Spirit folks, for many Indigenous pre-contact communities, there were some nations that, yes, that only had 2 genders, while others had 3. Some nations had 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Some nations had 12 different genders. How do we conceive of a world that has more than 2 genders? And we'll be talking a little bit about that. Today, most people associate the term with lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, Indigenous people. However, the work of Two-Spirit organizations, leaders, and elders and community members is more akin to this traditional understanding of who were we within a pre-contact setting, and what is the application as well as the relevancy of those teachings or knowledges and ways for us today in 2022, who are Indigenous and are on the gender and or the sexual orientation spectrum. Now, where did the term Two-Spirit come from? Up until contact, those nations that had a Two-Spirit tradition or this gender diversity framework or way, we had our own words within our own languages that named, accounted, and identified our Two-Spirit relatives. And so I modeled that at the beginning of the talk when I was introducing ourselves. And I said, first of all, I did my nation affiliation, that I was Nehau. But I also then went on to say that I am Two-Spirit, Niha Ayakwe. Now, I didn't identify as a man, Niha Napueo, nor did I identify as a woman, Niha Asquia. I said Niha Ayakwe. And Ayakwe was our word for our male assigned Two-Spirit individuals within a Cree context. Now, I put 1492, because that's kind of like a big year for us. October 10th, the Indigenous people that we would call from the Greater Antilles, that's when CC showed up there in that territory, put the Spanish flag down, goes, ha ha, I discovered you, right? Well, the counter narrative to that is on October 10th, 1492, the Indigenous peoples of the Greater Antilles, which we would call this area, they woke up and they discovered CC on their shores. And so this is really important because both of those truths hold true. And what I'm trying to draw into attention is the framework in which that we look at the truth, because both truths, in one respect, we were discovered, and in the other truth, we discovered CC, right? But 1492, and we're so happy that CC discovered us, because here we are just like rambling lost in our big old continent, right? Up until around 1989 to 1990, there was, prior to that, in the mid or the early 16th century, about 1525, there were these French missionaries that were wandering around Turtle Island, and they saw these like male-assigned individuals that were hanging around at the women's camp and doing women's work, right? Or female-assigned individuals that were hanging out and doing the work of men. And so the French missionaries were like, huh, this doesn't fit into our rigid binary gender system. You know, just like the good book said, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? So like, what do we call them? What do we call them? And so there was this Persian word barja that spread throughout Europe. It first showed up in Italian as bardasso, then it showed up in Spanish as bardaxa. And in the early 16th century, it shows up in French from these French missionaries as berdache. But if we go back to that Persian word, it really had kind of a yucky, well, I would say yucky connotation or translation. It translates into, and there's a couple of translations. One, it is a young man or boy who serves as a succubus, succubus. You'll have to Google that word because it's a crazy word, right? Or a nutty word, let's say. Or a male homosexual partner or prostitute, or a passive homosexual partner. Passive being like an anal male receptive partner. And so for many, many years, the word berdache was used in scholarship by the Academy of those that were studying us. There were even some Two-Spirit organizations that use the word berdache within their name. But starting in 1975 in the Bay Area, there was a bunch of community members that came together, like Barbara Cameron, Randy Burns, as well as others. And they were like, who are we? And so they began this organizing of gay and lesbian Native Americans. And that culminated, and there was a conversation that was started in 1989, but at the 1990 gathering that happened here in Canada, just outside of Winnipeg, at that third annual Basket and Bow gathering, there was a grand council that was called, a talking circle. And they said, you know, we hate this word berdache. And they rejected the word berdache for many and for numerous reasons. Most of which was, you know, it was all about he and him. It wasn't inclusive or honoring of our Two-Spirit sisters. And so, but there were many nations that were represented at that gathering, you know, from the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe Nation, the Cree Nation, the Sioux Nation, the Lakota Nation. And so what they wanted to do was to come up with the term that was multinational or transnational that spoke across these various different nations. And so after many, many rounds and much discussion, they came up with the term berdache, or they came up with the term and they landed on the term Two-Spirit. They wanted a term that reflected about the combination of both masculinity and femininity, which attributed to males in feminine roles and females in masculine roles. And there we get a pivot. The pivot was to your role within societies, i.e. gender, and it was a pivot away from sex and sexuality, or this like sexual orientation connotation that was embodied and wrapped up with that word berdache. Now, there are problems around the acquisition as well as the utilization around Two-Spirit. And that just because you meet someone who may be LGBTQI and Indigenous to Turtle Island, you cannot make the assumption that one, they know what Two-Spirit is, or two, that they actually use Two-Spirit. And so again, we just be really attentive to meeting the community where the community is, and they may not know these teachings as a result of colonization, or they may know it and reject it because it is an English term and it is like pan-national or transnational, and they would want to opt for something that is more, that is centering of their ways and their words. Now, how do we conceive of a world that has more than two genders? Now, I'm not going to go through this list. This is a survey. I just looked across Turtle Island and I just picked and chose a couple of examples. And each of these examples are nation specific. So this is not attributed to one nation. It is an aggregate from a bunch of different nations. So I'm not going to go through each one of these lists. I'm just going to highlight two and compare or juxtapose from a Cree way to a Sioux way. Now, for us Crees, the way that we formed our societies is that we had two big dominant camps or two big dominant societies. We had the Napweo, our men's camp, and they went down on hunts and went down on war parties. And then we also had the Esquia, and the Esquia would be our women's camp. And they gathered, right? Now there was a lot more to their roles, but I'm just like distilling it down to hunting and gathering, okay? Also, it's just incredibly important. Although we translate Napweo to man, the literal translation of Napweo is keepers of the fire. So we actually don't have a word for man. It was about your role, keepers of the fire. Where Esquia, we translate to woman, but we look at the translation of Esquia is the carriers of water or the givers of life. Again, English hides the things. Like we actually built into our terms is these roles, our gender roles. Now, the way that us Crees also worked is that a man or Napweo was never allowed in a Esquia or a woman's camp. And a woman, Esquia, was never allowed in a Napweo camp. Was that good? Was that bad? Well, that's just how I want to suspend judgment because that's just how we rolled. And so if there was ever imbalance or disharmony amongst these two camps, you know, a man couldn't walk over to a woman's camp, and a woman couldn't walk over to the men's camp and say, hey, what's going on? What's happening, right? But us as a Yaqui, guess what? We had unfettered and equal access to both camps. And so we were the only folks that could float between both camps. And so if there was ever imbalance or disharmony, we played this mediator role or this mediation role in which that we could go over to the men's camp and we're like, hey, men, what's going on? What's happening? We could float over to the women's camp. We're like, hey, women, what's the skinny, right? And what we could do is go back and forth and mediate balance or to resolve maybe the miscommunication or if there was like an actual tension to resolve it. Or to find a way to resolve it so that we could bring harmony and balance amongst these two camps. An Esquia couldn't do this, and a Napweo couldn't do this, but just us as a Yaqui could do this. And so for those nations that had 12 different genders, we had 12 different camps, each having a different role within society that was different from all the other genders. And so I think is the big takeaway. It's just you had a different function or a different role within society that separated you out from other genders and other roles. Now, if I were Sioux, there wouldn't be that expectation that I would be a mediator, but there would be a societal expectation that I would be the officiant of a naming ceremony. So my good friend Del First, who is Sioux, and Winkday, that's how you would say Two-Spirit in their language, has resurrected that role of being the officiant of the naming ceremony. So this is why there cannot be one definition of what all Two-Spirit people do. Two-Spirit is going to mean something different if you're Cree, Sioux, if you're Navajo, or Arapaho, or Anishinaabe, or Nucholneth. And so that's why you can't offer a definition. You can only offer a framing or a framework of what Two-Spirit is. Now, I've collected about 130 terms of our Two-Spirit people. And I'm building upon the work that was done by the Bay Area Gay American Indian Organization and off of Willie Roscow's work. Now, I must share that there are omissions, there is flat out wrong information, and there is missing information from this database. And you're like, Harlan, why are you getting out misinformation, right? Well, I wish that I could sit up in the academy and comb through this database and make it pristine and beautiful and shiny. However, that could take a lifetime. Heck, it could take like in multiple lifetimes. And in that time, more of these teachings and more of this knowledge could be lost. And so the next 9 slides are to support a conversation. And I encourage people to look at this database. And if they see their nation, to go through the validation processes. Is that the right term? Are there other terms? And is there a good translation or a better translation for those words? Now, for the Cayuga, that is a member of the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse in northern New York State, southern Quebec, and Ontario. And so these are entries that I'm like working on right now. The Cree entry is a good, clean entry. It was validated by 21 primary Cree speakers who were elders within Alberta. You will also, I just want to make note that, for Isquiacan, Napuecan, that it translates into fake woman or fake man, respectively. But my elders assured me that there was no negative connotation that was wrapped up in that word. It's just the English doesn't have a good way of translating those words. And so I could put pretend man or pretend woman, but again, like pretending may perhaps carry a negative connotation, but there was no negative connotation in our Cree way of speaking. I'm working again with another Haudenosaunee nation, and that would be the Mohawk, and I'm working on the translation. I will not try to pronounce that first word, but I love the translation of they have a pattern. Like, what does that mean? And it's a peek into their ontological of like, what does that mean they have a pattern? And what are folks that don't have patterns? Like, it just prompts so many questions, right? For the Nicholnath entry, this is a new entry, and it's probably been about 75 years since these have been shown within a public domain. Nicholnath is northern western coast of Vancouver Island. And I remember doing a talk, and there was a Nicholnath elder, Lillian Howard. Lillian Howard has like since transitioned to the spirit world. And Lillian came to me after my talk and she said, I really wish that my relative would have known of these words of our people before they took their life. Seneca, that's another Haudenosaunee nation of the 6 nations, and I'm working on the translation. Guasala is another northern British Columbia First Nations people. And what I like about this was, again, I don't have the sex assignment for the word. I'm still working on this one. But the translation is a man who lives or lived as a woman. And so there is no tense within their language. Their verbs are both past, present, and future, which is kind of cool, right? Again, you can just like pick apart all of these words of like, it gives you a little peek into how they, or these terms, how folks like ontologically of like how they're thinking of the world and their worldview. So these words are so incredibly important. For where there's a word, there's a story. Where there's a word, there's a history. But more importantly, where there's a word, there's a people. And so how these words work is, so we go, hey, Two-Spirit community, we're doing like a powwow or a gathering or an event, right? And if the individual answers that call and shows up, and let's say they're male assigned and Zuni, and if they don't know their word, Lahamana, we gift them their word, Lahamana, and a framework, this talk, to understand it. And then the magic and or the medicine and the transformation happens And I've seen this happen over and over again, where folks go like, what does it mean to be Lahamana? What is Lahamana? And what is my role and purpose as a Lahamana for my Zuni people? And calls them back home and roots and centers their ingenuity. In absence of these words, and as also knowledge of these words, but also as a result of colonization, often our LGBT and queer relatives who are Indigenous think they have to make a choice between being LGBTQI plus and being Indigenous, or worse, they're called nasty names and they're run from their communities where they go to an urban setting only to answer the call and to show up, and they realize that they don't have to make that false distinction. In claiming their Zuni identity, built into the Zuni identity is their Ilhamana. They're there already. And so I know that Alex Wilson has a beautiful paper that's what it's called, the coming in process for our Indigenous relatives. You know, they have to come out, then they learn of Lahamana, and so that facilitates the coming in process, which I think is so beautiful. And so I see my role as a community organizer to facilitate that coming in process for our Indigenous relatives. Now, we're not alone. If you look at other Indigenous communities across the world, although they wouldn't use Two-Spirit, Two-Spirit is only here for Turtle Island, because you will remember that at the 1990 gathering, it was only Indigenous people of Turtle Island that agreed to use that term. And so for us to, and although these terms are gender diverse and they're very similar to our conceptions of the gender diversity or non-binary conceptions of gender, we cannot impose our way on the rest of the world because that would make us colonizers, right? So it would be great if we could, I would love to have an international convening of Indigenous gender and sexually diverse peoples to have that similar sort of conversation of how do we want to organize and how do we mutually support each other within a multinational or a transnational or a global setting. So we have the Hijra in India, the Bulbul in Pakistan, or the Mahu in Hawaii, the Fa'afafine in Samoa. And this list, again, is by no means complete. This can go on and on and on. You know, and if you're looking for a European example, you have the women of Black within Iberia. And that's an Iberian example, which is like really kind of cool if you want to dig into that conversation. Now, who were some of our Two-Spirit people of long ago? There's only about 20 known historical images of our Two-Spirit relative. And so you're seeing about like 50%, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, less than 50%, 48%, 40% of the known images of our Two-Spirit relatives. And there's very, very few pictures of our Indigenous women, and there's very, very few pictures of, from a Canadian perspective or north of the 49th parallel of our Two-Spirit relatives. I'm right now and have been in consultation with the Nchulnath, some archives from the Nchulnath people that are housed in the British Columbia Provincial Archive. And then I think that we've identified some other pictures, historical documentations of their Two-Spirit people. I put myself in the archive. So here I am when I was 5. Okay, for whatever reason, I don't know why, but my fly is down. Like, why did my mama not put up my fly? And I always want to point that out because I don't want people to say, why is he showing the picture with his fly down? Now, that all kind of came to an end. And so this is a picture of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which is the first residential boarding school that opened up on Turtle Island. And it was opened up in 1879 and closed in 1918 by this dude named Captain Richard Henry Pratt. About 100,000 Native children went through this one school. There are schools all across Canada and the United States. About 100,000 Native children from approximately 140 different nations. Do you know how many folks graduated from this one school out of 100,000? 158 total, not per year. Could you imagine to really, if your university only graduated 158 people out of your entire operations, would you be still open? No, they replicated this model. Now, what does this have to do with being two-spirit? Well, this has everything and nothing. And that sounds contradictory. But if we deconstruct the subject matter of this image, we will see that it does have everything and it does have nothing to do with being two-spirit. Like if we look at a third of this picture, I'm going to make some assumptions that those individuals were male assigned. That's the assumption. And their gender expression is coded as being masculine or man. And so you can see hair cut over the ears, and they're wearing a pantsuit. Now, in the lower third of, and again, assuming that these are female assigned individuals and their gender expressions, again, are coded as girls, young women, or young women. And again, you can see that with shoulder length hair and our skirts and dresses. And so a part of these schools and the assimilation into Western ways was the imposition of the rigid binary gender system that was imposed upon us as Indigenous people, leaving room for only their two genders. Gone are the third, the fourth, the fifth, or even the 12th different genders. I know that there are two-spirit people there. But now there was that imposition of that rigid binary gender system that was gone for our two-spirit relatives. So in summary, two-spirit is the intersection of those who embody diverse sexualities, gender, both roles and expressions, and who are Indigenous to Turtle Island is a community organizing tool and not an identity. It is going to mean something different depending on what nation an individual is from or a member of. Two-spirit refers also, and this is key, to a history or tradition that predates Western notions and concepts such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, intersex, and the list can go on and on and on, and is about reclaiming and restoring a rightful place of honor, respect, and dignity within the individual's nation. This is, as a result, this is deep decolonizing work that centers one's ingenuity and calls two-spirit people home, and is therefore about mending the sacred hoop. There's really kind of cool work. Now, what does this have to do with research? And for you all, right? What I'm going to do is pivot quickly and talk about the Two-Spirit Dry Lab. This is our beautiful new logo. It was designed by the talented Margaret August, who is a Coast Salish designer. And you can kind of see that the face is split in half for the both masculine and femininity. You can choose whatever side you want for either one of those codes. It is a moon to show the phases of research and that it is ever changing and moving. And also at the forehead is two salmon to flag that we are on Coast Salish territory and they're meeting each other. And so this is now we'll be talking about some of our decolonizing practices when it comes to the research as well as research ecosystem. So the Two-Spirit Dry Lab is a collection. There's 25 lab members. We are Indigenous and settler researchers that are coming together to look at how and if Two-Spirit is a facilitator to accessing health and wellness information. And we also have two resident elders that are Coast Salish that help and inform, but also provide support for the Two-Spirit Dry Lab. Now, most labs, when they get together, it's always about the what. What do we do? But for the two, because we're taking in centering of Indigenous ways, it's more important for us to lean into process or how do we work? And so the, excuse me, and how do we come together? So the Two-Spirit Dry Lab, as I said before, is a transdisciplinary or a multidisciplinary collaboration of Indigenous and non-Indigenous epidemiologists, knowledge translation leads, sociologists, research, and also community members that just want to come together and learn about doing research. We also try our best effort to use Indigenous methodologies and approaches. And so what we do is we use a two-eyed seeing approach, which is a teaching that was offered by the Mi'kma'ki elder Albert Marshall. And for two-eyed seeing is that from one eye, we look at some of the good things that colonization has brought. Like I'm standing here in this beautiful cotton shirt, right? Not scratchy leather. That's a good thing. And the other eye is that we look at the goodness of Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. And what we do is we hold the two up, the two systems, the two knowledge systems, and we put them in concert with one another. All of our meetings and work are done in the circle, and it was how we are formed and we are led in the circle, meaning that we are collaborative, non-hierarchical, and what we do is there is this belief of consensus decision-making processes that all 25 lab members have to agree to what we do. So if we get to an output and not all of our lab members are in agreement to that outlook, it is a failure. But if we progress as one and we get to an output and all of our lab members arrive as one, and there's still kindness and love in our hearts for the lab as well as the work of all of the lab members, wherever we land, we'll be in a good place, and we know that we'll be on good terms. Now, we are a lab of shared leadership. Our team was drawn together with a unity of purpose and a deep commitment to consensus decision-making, with the aim and requirement of acceptance of all lab members. And these are combined with the following principles or tools of leadership. One, equality and conversational turn-taking. These are our talking circle principles. And when we use talking circles as our protocol. Taking the time to know one another, and that is about centering of relationships. If that we don't know who we are, then how can we do good work together? And then finally, listening attentively or actively, or what we call deep listening, where we listen to what is said, but also what is not said. And so we listen into the void. The above components create the possibility for psychological safety, resulting in the following outcomes: supporting each other so that we can bring forth the best ideas, working together in mindful and respectful ways, and then finally developing innovative capabilities. Now, how do we apply that to our research? So we have been working primarily in collaboration with the Community-Based Research Center, which is an LGBT community-based organization here that has an office here in Vancouver. They have a national survey called Sex Now, and it's Canada's largest and longest running national periodic for gay, bi, trans, and two-spirit and queer men, those individuals who identify on the masculine spectrum. And it is a sexual health and mental health survey. And we started off with working off the 2015 data set. From our work and engagement with the 2015 data set, we offered some suggestions or revisions that impacted and changed the 2018 in-person Sex Now survey to better capture health-related and experiential knowledges of Indigenous participants. So what are we talking about? In 2015, and this is prior to us as a lab, we had Q1 that asked gender identity, and we offered two-spirit as a variable. In Q2, we offered, for sexual identity, we offered a variable of two-spirit. And then in Q70, we asked for ethnic and cultural origins, and we offered a variable of Aboriginal, which was broken down to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, because it's a Canadian survey. The results for about 4.5% of the overall sample size were Aboriginal, giving us an N value of 363. Of the 363, both in Q1 and Q2, 156 participants selected two-spirit. And we're like, shnikes, that's huge, right? But then I was like, tap the brakes. Of those 156, how many selected Aboriginal in Q70? And we found that 62% of those 156 people that selected two-spirit were not Aboriginal, were not Indigenous. We're like, huh. And so we collect Two-Spirit data better. And we could put it in to the racial, ethnic, and or cultural questionnaire, right? And tuck it in there. And so what we did was we offered for the 2018 revision that individuals who selected Indigenous were then given the variables: are you First Nations, Métis, Inuit, prefer to self-describe, prefer not to say, because sometimes it's not safe to say. And so if an individual said, okay, yeah, I'm Two-Spirit, then, sorry, First Nations, but they could have selected anything there. Then and only then do they get the question, are you Two-Spirit? And then we can look at the results. So in 2018 for the in-person survey, the overall participation or rate of participation for Indigenous respondents was now a 9%. So it was like a doubling of that sample size, from 2015 at 4.5 to around 9% here in 2018, with about with a split of 60% were First Nations, 30% were Métis, and 3% were Inuk. This mirrors the national Indigenous data set of that 60-43 split, which is kind of cool that we have this really cool sample that mirrors the Indigenous breakdown nationally here in Canada. 42% of the Indigenous respondents identified as Two-Spirit. And again, not everyone uses the term Two-Spirit. 0% of the respondents were not Indigenous. And so we effectively walled off the Two-Spirit for only Indigenous respondents. Now, we typed up these results, and we were invited by the Institute for Gender and Health from the Canadian Institute for Health Research. We know that researchers have adopted this method and are implemented and are doing this really kind of cool research off of our method. Now, also for Q79 is prior to our involvement with the variables that we asked, like in the past year, which of the following resources have you gone to? Psychiatrist, registered counsel, social worker, clinical psych, peer, sex therapist, right? And what we did is we offered some Indigenous only respondents of elder and knowledge keepers. Now, prior to this, if the individual's reality wasn't like, for our Indigenous relatives, we did have folks that said that they went to elders and knowledge keepers exclusively. By not having those variables, the Indigenous person would have been said, oh, none of the above, and we would have made the assumption that they weren't accessing any of these services. Meanwhile, they are. And so it's really important that for your survey tool, that it represents the reality of those, because you can make these false assumptions that folks were not accessing cultural supports or supports, in this case, cultural supports for Indigenous people. I'm going to, we're also offering some decolonizing research. I'm getting a little anxious about time. So this is a cute little cartoon. Apple says, hey, we're both fruit, we both grow on trees, we're both round, so that must make us the same, right? And the orange goes, yeah, noodle, no, we're not the same. So this is known as testing the null hypothesis. And this serves the backbone of most epidemiological studies, as then it also then forms policy and papers and scholarship. And for the null hypothesis, we assume that two groups have no differences. And by showing there's a difference, further analysis is warranted. So what we're saying here is, and what the null hypothesis is, we assume two groups are not the same. Or sorry, two groups are the same. So how that works out is we have this national data set, 2018, that is often white dominated. We extract a subpop, in our case Indigenous, and because we think that these two groups are the same, we can do this compare and contrast, right? Well, is that a fair comparison? I was born an Indian and I'm going to die an Indian. Why should I be compared to white people? Like, I'm never going to be white. And also, because the system and systems have been set up by white people for white people, they will always have better outcomes than us, any minority. And And so what we will do is that we're always in a less than position. So I would argue that the null hypothesis becomes a site of white supremacy. Well, cisgendered, male, man supremacy. And also built into that is, how do we close the gap? Do we make the white people come and have the same rates that we have? Or implicit with this, we just have to make the minority more like the white people, and in our case, Indigenous. And so not only is the null hypothesis a site that I would argue is white supremacist, but it is also a site of colonization by making us. And so we reject that. And so what we do is we have a national data set, we extract an Indigenous case, we ignore the broader data set, and we do an intra-group comparison. So back to our little cartoon, like look at all of the comparisons that we can make intra-group wise, quantitatively. We can look at the sweetness to the bitterness, to the size of the piths, the number of seeds. There's so much to compare here within the group. So what does that look like in research? So we published a paper looking at the drivers of sexual health knowledge. In this study, we compared the respondents of those individuals who used Two-Spirit to describe themselves to Indigenous individuals who did not use Two-Spirit, that identified as GBMSM. And we found that there were significant differences between the drivers of sexual health knowledge. Then we examined the responses between those who lived in urban as opposed to rural and remote. And again, we found significant differences. From our analysis, we can offer guidance for those who are working or wanting to work with Indigenous and Two-Spirit people in more respectful and mindful ways. And you can kind of see that there's a fundamentally different conversation in rejecting the null hypothesis of showing there's differences between white respondents and Indigenous respondents. Now, we're also challenging some core tenets and building upon Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde, for those of us who stand outside of the society's circulation, society's definition of acceptable woman, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of differences, for those of us who are poor, who are lesbian, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them our strengths. And you can see that we are Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars and researchers. For the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. We agree with that. However, we take a slight spin on it because we have that two-eyed seeing approach from Albert Marshall. And so what we do is there are some good master's tools like quantitative analysis, but when quant is married with the null hypothesis, not cool. But quant, counting and looking at mathematical relationship is cool. So what we do is we use some of the master's tools, we ignore the master's house, and we go down the street and we build and construct our own village or community using some of the master's tools. So what does that look like? I'm not going to go deep into the theory of syndemics. It's like this new fancy schmancy theory that basically shows that there's this mutual reinforcing action of disease and conditions, which Singer showed in 1994, that an individual who was experiencing violence may increase their chances of getting HIV by 10%, or substance use 10%, or adverse mental health 10%. And so an individual that was experiencing violence, substance use, or adverse mental health, you would think 10 plus 10 plus 10 equals 30. No, what they showed was when there was two or more drivers or social conditions at play, it may increase the chances of getting HIV to 95%. So that's why sin, interactive, demic, syndemics. Well, I was like, yeah, that's kind of cool. But when I go to ceremony and I'm crawling into the sweat lodge, my forehead hits the ground as I go in and I say this expression, mitakuye-sin. Mitakuye-sin is a Sioux expression that says it's a heart language or a prayer. And it means all my relations or everything is connected, everything is related. Does that kind of sound familiar? So for our paper on the drivers of sexual health knowledge, rather than affirming the master's house, the theory of syndemics, what we did was we use a theory of mitakuye-sin that affirmed our worldview, and we showed quantitatively how, or statistically, how everything is connected and how everything is related, our analysis of the drivers of sexual health knowledge. So when two-spirit data is collected in a culturally safe and affirming way, health researchers are given the opportunity to promote rigorous science that considers biological sex and all genders, including our non-binary relatives and our two-spirit people. Research conducted in this way has the potential to expand our understanding of health within a diversity framework that considers how determinants such as ethnicity, race, socioeconomic status, disability, sexual orientation, migration, age, geography interacts with sex and or gender. So we're doing a much more robust sex and gender-based analysis. By bringing these considerations into focus, they can help formulate health research, policies, and programs that are relevant, respectful, and mindful, and also representative of the diversity of our entire population. References, done. Oh my gosh. I am so sorry that I talked much.
No, you're amazing. Like, I was having some conversations, and some of us wish you would never stop talking. Like, just amazing. I want to open it up. I'm just, yes, let me open it up. Anyone who would like to ask a question, make a comment, please unmute yourself and share at this time. I'd like to say there were a couple of things that you said, Harlan. I really appreciate how well this connects to International Education Week, because your attitude, even, the whole null theory, the beauty of international education and global health exchange is to celebrate the differences, not to say that we're all the same, but to really celebrate how we're different and how we can complement each other and how we can do things differently to help each other to improve and to advance and to be creative. The other thing that you highlight consistently is honoring the perspectives and the gifts that the different perspectives bring. And some of my favorite quotes from Senator Fulbright, they really highlight that we want to understand there are different perspectives, and that all the perspectives can be honored and appreciated, and that it just helps us to be more empathetic towards each other, more understanding. And you consistently say that through, and the way you present everything that you present. And I really, I love that. I appreciate it. I think it bears repeating constantly. We need to remind ourselves all the time that this is the way. This is the way.
And I think that, a part of reconciliation is just that we must get into better relations, right? Like, I know that, as Indigenous people, we can't say, go home. Because some folks have been here for like generations, right? So we're bound by the land.
Right.
How do we get into good relations with one another so it's mindful, respectful, and even loving?
Right.
And so for the Two-Spirit Dry Lab, we are a lab of reconciliation. We are getting in good relations with one another. And so my non-Indigenous and Two-Spirit relatives, they come and help co-present with me, and they're speaking with us. Yeah. And we're not saying, hey, surrender all of your colonization and it's all bad. We're like, no, epidemiologists, bring your quant analysis, leave the null hypothesis at the door, because that's not cool. Bring your quant, like bring what and let's put them in concert with one another. Yeah. And that, I think, is that relational accountability. And the lab is a model of being in good relations, in which that our non-Indigenous relatives don't think that they're better than us Indigenous people, and think that our ways and our knowledge, like Mitakuye Sin, is less than or devalued, but we put them in concert with one another. And it's also taking an Indigenous approach where we are literally looking after the collective well-being and tending to the. So when we got into our strategic planning this year, and we did our first opening circle, folks were talking about grief, loss, disconnection. And I was like, ooh, we have work. And so the elders again held space. And we did the healing work for our individual, but our collective healing, so that folks could show up fully present. And that was extended to our non-Indigenous relatives. And so, and again, yeah, like as a research group, what the heck are we doing about lab? Like what are we doing about healing, right? But if we can't come together and heal and show up with love and kindness in our hearts and model that, how then do we model that out to community? And how then do we so it's circles within circles within circles.
Right.
And again, it goes back to what Gandhi was like saying of like, be the change that you want to be. And so our research is relational, i.e., let me uncode that. Our research is supported by love that is informed by relationships. And so we are a lab of reconciliation, of that relational accountability. And yeah, we're doing it with quantitative analysis, which no one gets feelsy about quant, but we do, because it's about the relationships that are so incredibly important.
Yeah, beautifully said.
Well, I would like to wish everyone again International Education Week. And I'm still waiting for an invitation. I would love to come and to bring a couple of our lab members to meet with you all in in Kansas City, KC.
Yeah, we're
For
working
some
on that.
barbecue.
Yes, we're working on that. And I will send you an email. We need to start working on dates so we can figure out when you're available to come.
Cool. Now, in Cree, how we say a formal thank you to a group is Kinonaskomtininawawa. Informally, we would just say hi, hi. So it is with the greatest humility and honor that I say a formal thank you to you all. And the closest expression that we have to goodbye is examaga. And examaga means until then. We don't actually have a goodbye. Because it means that our paths, now their paths have crossed, they're forever intertwined, and they will cross again. Which means, if we critically think about it, that our paths, they will cross again either in this life or in some other life. So that means that our paths have crossed sometime before. My relatives, it's so good that we get to share, and our paths have crossed together in this life once again. And I look forward to the next time that we come together as one and we get to share our journey together. The greatest humility and honor that I say, hi, hi, examaga.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This was beautiful. Appreciate you. Happy International Education Week. Thank you, Harlan.
Thank you.
Take care. God bless.